Pause for Payments with Kristy. I'm Kristy Duncan, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome here Janet Logan from DoubleDigit Sales, an amazing firm that delivers innovative sales effectiveness training to some of the country's largest organizations. Welcome, Janet.
Thank you so much.
Janet, you use stories as a key part of delivering powerful messages, be they in meetings, in interviews, or in our personal lives. Can you share with us how you came to realize the power of storytelling to strengthen communications?
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking about, stories, getting ready for today's session. And I did ask myself, where did this all sort of come from? And I realized that years ago in a previous life, I had a client who regularly would reach out to me and say, hey, let's get together. I'd love to hear what stories you have. And that was always his opening volley, which is, what stories? And I think that's when the seed first planted in my mind around the fact that people love to hear stories and they love to learn by hearing these stories. And of course, then the more I looked around, the more I realized how much all of our worlds are really wrapped up into stories. So whether those are in books or Netflix or videos or movies, we are all drawn to stories as a part of our world, as a part of the way we learn, as a part of how we connect with people. And so it got me and DoubleDigit Sales thinking about, what about stories from a communications perspective, but in a more structured way? For example, as a tool when we are communicating, engaging, selling, how can that work? And I read a great book, which is called What's Your Story? And it got the wheels turning about helping people think about stories as a tool that they can use in how they communicate or how they sell or how they persuade, but as a business tool. And not something that you just sort of wing, but what are some ways to help people actually craft really good, powerful stories that can help them achieve the purpose of their meeting, their goals, connect with others, but in a much more intentional way. And I think that's sort of the genesis of it all.
Wow, that's really interesting. I love that story. Thanks, Janet.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned something there that I want to just unpack a little bit. And you said, how do people craft powerful stories? And that's something that I've never thought about before, like crafting a story. I guess you're actually building the story from the ground up. What do you mean by that? What are some tips about crafting powerful stories that you could share?
Yeah. So when we think about crafting stories, I think there's a couple of things that come to my mind. Is that using stories, number one, is that they need to be short. Everyone loves sitting around the bar and having somebody share a story, and you kind of get drawn into it, but we've all been in that place where you think, okay, is this story ever going to end? And where are we going with this story? So I think one element is in using stories is thinking about keeping them short and sort of tight. Along with short, I think there's another piece, which is really critical, which is thinking about where am I going with this story? What is the purpose of this story? What is my intention for telling this story? So that you're using this tool as a tool and not just as a filler. And part of that is thinking about, and sometimes even saying, hey, I'd love to tell you a story. And the reason I'm telling you this story is because, or at the end of a story, say, hey, the reason I shared that story is to illustrate X, Y, Z. So being very clear on what is the purpose of the story and why you've shared that story. So short, purposeful, and intentional. And then I do believe that there is an art to creating a great story. And just to share a little bit, if you're okay with that, around that, the art of creating a great story is, I think great stories are about people and characters. So that could be about you. That could be about a boss. It could be about your team. It could be about a client. It could be about a friend. But great stories are about people. And they should feature in a story because people relate to people. And that's what makes stories, I think, different than a case study. In a case study, you might have, someone's title. But a real story is about individuals and human beings. And I think that we connect with that. I think great stories do have a clear structure for sure. I said they need to be tight and short and intentional. And I think that's all in the structure. And in terms of a structure, I think there needs to be some clear things that happen. So there needs to be a beginning, there needs to be a middle, there needs to be an end. And in the middle, I think you need some good turning points. So what I would call actions or things that happen in a story. So character, action, great structure, but then there's the fourth thing, which I think is also like character, really important. So I kind of call it the bookend of a great story is emotion. Great stories share emotion or solicit emotion in others. If you think about when you're listening to a story, what do you connect with? It's not the structure. It's actually the people in the story, as well as how they felt or how you felt. And so people relate to characters and they relate to emotions. So if I'm telling a client a story about other clients I've worked with, they can relate to those clients in that situation. They can relate to how nervous they were or frustrated where they were or elated they were when a solution was presented. And I think, to make stories really powerful, it's not just sort of winging it, but it's really thinking about how do I make them short, intentional, really feature characters and really make sure that there's an emotion in there, because that's what makes a story memorable. People remember the emotion. Just last thing I'll say is, the expression, people don't always remember what you say, but they'll remember how you made them feel. Sort of a common expression you see around. And I think this is one of the elements of the power of stories is that, there's lots of facts and information out there, but I think what people really connect to is the emotional part of a story and how it makes them feel. That was a long answer.
That's a great answer. I love that. There's some really good nuggets in there, Janet. Thanks for that.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk about stories and why they're important, and especially now in this COVID-19 environment. We talked before getting on the air about what has changed in our new environment where we're doing things, virtually everything is virtual now. We're not doing anything face-to-face over a Starbucks table or a meeting table, or even a lot of our family discussions are held via Zoom or online.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it important to tell stories in this new environment?
Yeah, for sure. Great question. I mean, I think stories are important to tell no matter what the environment. I think that there's a lot of benefits of crafting and telling great stories. I think stories are, as I've said before, memorable because people connect, as I said, to the people in the stories and the emotions in the stories. So I think that they're memorable no matter, now or any other time. I think stories help people relate. So I think it makes you in a way more relatable when you tell a story. And I think that's a benefit no matter when, COVID-19 or otherwise. I think stories also differentiate ourselves. People, as I said, remember stories. There's actually data that shows that retention goes up to 60 to 70% when stories are shared. People can't retain all the facts, but they do retain stories. Maybe not the whole thing, but elements of the story. And there's real research and data that proves the power of a story being memorable. And I think because they're memorable, you then become, you can differentiate yourself, which I think from a career perspective is important. When you want to be remembered, whether that's because you've interviewed, whether it's because you're a leader or a coach, whether it's because you're in a client situation, whether you're trying to make a point, people remember stories. So I think those things, relatable, memorable, differentiate ourselves, I would say those are important no matter when. I think now during this time, there's maybe two other benefits that I would highlight is that, I know we're all about physical distancing, and I like to say this really explicitly. This is about physical distancing. It's not about social distancing. And I think this is a time where we can actually, despite our physical differences, can maximize our human and interpersonal connections. And I know we're using all kinds of other technology to do that, but I'm sure you'll recognize with this when you say that you haven't spoken to your friends as much as you have in the last 5 or 6 weeks, because we're making the time to have Zoom tales, or, chats, coffee chats, or walk and talks, as I call them, more than we ever have before, because that sense of community and connection is really important. So just circling back to stories, I think in particular right now, one of the amazing things about stories is that when you share a story, what happens is that the other person wants to share a story back. And again, there's actually research that, the emotion in a story actually releases dopamines and all this, brain elements, brain chemistry. But that aside, when I share a story, it makes you think of a story. And then you share a story, and that makes me think of a story. And so that's creating connection. And so I really believe that right now, the power of stories, aside from what I've shared earlier, because it's always important, is an amazing tool to create connection in a time where we are physically distant. I think as well, maybe related to that, is that when you're sharing a story, you're telling a little bit about yourself. And that's, in a way, showing a little bit about you and who you are. And, I'm sure there's lots of people who are watching this who are really familiar with Brene Brown and, the importance of vulnerability. And I think stories are an amazing way to show a little bit about ourselves by the stories that we share about our own experiences, about what we've seen, about what we've observed. And I think that's very, very powerful in a time where people are disconnected and far away. So creating connection, super important right now. And, stories are a way to show a little bit about ourselves, maybe show a little bit of vulnerability about who we are and what we're living and experiencing. And I think that's really powerful right now.
Wow, I love those insights, Janet. Can I tell a quick story? A quick story? 30 seconds. So for the very first time in my life, last weekend, I cut my own hair. And it was like something I never thought I would ever do in my life. And I'm telling everybody, okay, so this is the home haircut. I didn't get out the bowl, but it was like one of those first experiences just due to this pandemic situation. So
yeah. So, that's a perfect example. I don't know what I said, but clearly something I just said, it made you think of a story, which is probably around vulnerability and showing a little bit about yourself, which made you think, hey, I'm going to share a story about how I cut my own hair. And I'm absolutely 100% sure that there's so many people listening to this right now who want to jump onto this bandwagon because they have their own story, whether it's doing their own nails or figuring things out that they would never have otherwise done during this time. Stories beget more stories. And, stories, because of that, they actually bring people closer together.
That's lovely. Well, that's so important now as we're feeling somewhat disconnected from all of our colleagues and clients and families. So now stories are more important than ever. Mm-hmm. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about our audience in particular, which is mainly comprised of women, career women who may not be comfortable telling stories. Mm-hmm. Can you share some stories or examples of how powerful stories can be to help people build careers? For example, in the boardroom or a meeting room or in an interview, for example?
Yeah. So first of all, we all know how to tell stories. So to say that, not comfortable telling stories, I think we all have the ability to tell stories. I think we're born with an ability to tell stories. I think we've grown up with stories our entire life, and I think it's part of who we are as human beings. So I think that the challenge is more, how to tell a story and when to tell a story. I think these are some of the elements that are probably tougher. Yesterday I was on 3 calls. I had a call with a client. All we talked about was sharing stories about our business and about their business, about our people, about her people, about, what's happening for us long term. And she was sharing stories about what she is hoping to see in their business. I had a conversation with a friend who lives very far away. It was all about, what we're experiencing in our families and helping each other as mothers and parents and professional businesswomen, because she runs her own business in Geneva. It was all about stories. I had another call with another woman who leads an amazing charity organization that I'm very, very involved in, which is bringing arts and arts programming to Indigenous communities and communities at risk in Africa. All we talked about was stories. All we shared was stories. We all do this. So I would ask the audience to think about the last conversation they were in. I bet you the stories were there. So I think stories is something that we all do. I think I shared earlier in this call, there is an art of being able to craft and tell a story that's short, that's to the point. In other words, it's intentional, but also features things like character, emotion, and a clear structure. I think stories are helpful in so many different dimensions as in a professional environment, whether that be in our interviews, if we're looking to advance our careers, telling stories about what we've experienced, what we've seen, what we've accomplished, what's important to us. You can use stories to tell, to answer questions about what your strengths are, where your opportunities are. You can tell stories that illustrate those. I think stories are very powerful for managers in managing people, in sharing with their teams, experiences that they've had. It also pulls them out to share their own stories. I think stories are very powerful for coaches right now. And, whether you're a manager as a coach or whether you're a peer coach, sharing stories can help me feel more comfortable in knowing that I'm not by myself. Other people have lived this story before me. So I think stories are a powerful tool in so many elements of our professional environment, whether that's advancing our career, working with our peers. And as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, stories are a great tool as we partner with our clients. So that could be sharing stories of what other clients have experienced or other challenges that our clients are going through, and how, maybe your company has helped solve those challenges through what you do. That's a very powerful way and it's a different way versus just, here's what I do. I'm going to pitch my product or service. You're doing that, but you're doing it through the story of another client who's another human being who faced a very similar challenge. So yeah, I guess what I'm saying is that stories are a powerful tool in many areas of your career, whether that's in your career advancement, your role in working with others, or your role in working with clients. I think we all know how to do it. I think we probably need to spend a little time getting more intentional and maybe a little, shorter in some of the stories that we tell. And that's going to give us a tool that we can use that's sharp, because I know that we all innately have this capability of sharing stories. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Awesome. Are there any definite don'ts about storytelling, especially in a career environment?
Well, I think there's topics that, you want to stay away from. And I think that's real in any part of communication with clients internally, with your internal clients or partners or external clients. So I would say the don'ts of stories is, don't tell a story for the sake of telling a story. As I've said to you before, if you're going to tell a story, you're using it for a reason. I would say, I would say another thing around stories is when you tell a story, following your story, share why you've told that story and invite them to tell a story as well. Or have you had and what I mean by that is ask some questions. Have you had an experience like that? Or has that ever happened to you? Or can you relate to that? That causes them to share their own stories. And then it becomes a dialogue. I think where, stories can go wrong is when they're too long, they're unstructured, they're not really going anywhere, and they're not really inciting anybody else to add. I think a story is a mechanism to create dialogue. It shouldn't be just used as a drop it in the conversation.
Right.
Maybe one other thing I'll say to be careful about. is, even though we're talking about stories in terms of career development or coaching or mentoring or in communications or sales, I'm going to say that, some stories they don't all have to be positive. They don't all have to be success stories. Look at me. Look at, how great I am, or how wonderful this was. Sometimes the best stories are what we call failure stories, where this didn't go so well and I've learned because of it, and I'm better, stronger, more experienced because of it. So I would
It
say maybe
also
another.
it also opens you up to being more vulnerable and
Yes.
therefore more approachable, right?
Yeah,
More
100%. And,
human.
telling success story after success story about yourself, people are going to be like, okay, I know, I get it. You're great. But I think, changing that up and telling a few failure stories is a really powerful thing to do as well.
Yeah. I've heard it said that someone who's a great speaker is often even a better listener.
Mm,
And so I like your point about engaging the other person in the conversation. So you tell a story and then invite them to provide feedback or tell a story or reinforce the point or ask questions so that it becomes a dialogue. It's not just a monologue.
yeah,
Especially in a business setting, you don't want it just to be you know, the John Smith show or
exactly.
James Smith.
Exactly. Yeah.
Indeed. Janet, this has been fabulous input. I love your insights to storytelling. You've had a very successful career in sales, coaching, marketing, and other things. Are there pearls of wisdom that you might share with our audience, being women in the global payments ecosystem?
Um, yeah, that's a tough question. I think a couple of things are coming to my mind is, well, actually you said something that would be one of them, is the importance of being curious. I would say is probably a cornerstone to who I am as a person, my value set. But I think it's also one of the things that has allowed me to, live some pretty amazing experiences professionally. And when I say curious, I want to be really clear on what I'm saying is that when we think about curious, we think about someone who asks a lot of questions. And I do that. I do ask a lot of questions. That's true. But just to take it one step further, I think being really curious is seeking to understand, even when what you're hearing is not really what you want to hear. I think it is about wanting to learn. But I think there's another part about curiosity, because I really believe people are curious, not just when they're asking questions, but when they're really, truly listening to the answers. That is what I think makes someone really curious. So I would say that that would be a definite pearl of wisdom. And it's harder to do in tougher situations, to just, though you want to say something, is to hold back and really learn to, what we call at DoubleDigit Sales, question better and confirm and listen more. I would say that is for sure one pearl of wisdom. I think another one is, take the shot. Take the shot. There's a great quote. I'm sure many people have heard it by Wayne Gretzky, our famous Canadian hockey player, is you miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. And I am a believer in, you got to take the shot. And I would say that leads me probably to my third nugget is, and I tell my kids this all the time, is every experience is a good experience. So even if you take the shot and you miss it, you learn from it. If you take the shot and it gets deflected, you're still learning from it. And if you take the shot and you win it, you get in, you get into the net and you've moved ahead, you're still learning. So yeah, every experience is a good experience. So yeah, I would say those are the ones that really come to my mind. Maybe one other one, which is an expression that a lot of people are saying right now. I love it. And I really try and practice it. It's, wait for it, you do you. And what I mean by that is that I think there's a lot of power in, being confident of who you are, being authentic and being transparent in who you are. and you do you. So yeah, I think those are the things that are coming to my mind.
I love those. I love the you do you. I've heard that one quoted differently, but it's the same message is be yourself, everyone else is taken.
Exactly. Exactly.
Awesome. Well, Janet, you shared some awesome insights. I love your power of storytelling and your tips there to keep them short, to make sure they have purpose, and try to make them about people and engage some emotion in the story because that's where people really connect. But being able to use stories to differentiate ourselves in the workplace, in our families, in our friendships is also important and can be very powerful in helping to build relationships. I love the be curious and ask questions. That's so important.
And listen to the answers.
And listen
Because,
to.
we talk about Curious George, the little monkey who's always asking questions. But I think a person, as I like to say, I can go to a cocktail party and meet lots of people and ask lots of questions. But if I'm not really listening to the answers, does that really make me curious? I don't think so.
Yeah, if you're
So
sitting there with your cell phone and asking questions and really not paying attention, then yeah, that eye contact, that engagement, the asking questions and listening and asking more is really fully engaging with the other person.
yeah.
Awesome. I love the take the shot and quoting Wayne Gretzky. And that's something for some of our non-Canadian listeners who might not know that Wayne Gretzky is Canadian. Well, I'm sure they all do, but they might not know that quote from Wayne Gretzky. So take the shot. You miss 100% of the shots that you don't take. Awesome, awesome advice, especially when it comes to careers.
Yes.
Especially when it comes to careers.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and you do you. As a last parting thought, you do you, and be authentic. That's so important. Everybody else is taken.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Janet, for sharing your pearls of wisdom today and the power of storytelling and why it's so important even now as the world goes more and more digital.
Mm-hmm.
I really enjoyed our conversation, and I encourage our audience to join us for other webinars that we're doing online. And if you're interested, we'll put up a screen so you can contact either of us afterwards for further discussion and engagement. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.